Welcome to our lecture on speech codes theory. It's actually speech codes theory and ethnography. Ethnography is really the method here by which they use to Philipson uses to get to this theory. But this is one of my favorite theories that we cover in this class. And it's actually what I was kind of trained in graduate school. I studied speech codes and what I used for my dissertation, etc. So it's something that kind of has a special place in my heart. This is a theory that I think is fairly easy to understand, but at the same time there are a lot of components of this theory as well. So let's get right to it. Speech codes theory is kind of a meshing of two different ways of understanding communication. It meshes the idea of linguistics with the idea of ethnography to find out what speech codes are among certain cultural groups. When we talk about linguistics, what we're talking about is the particular way that people talk. It's like the emphasis that they'll put on it, the word choices that are used in particular settings, like inflections, tones, etc. Basically, all that goes into language, right? And so we're not only focused on the words themselves, but we're focused on lots of different kind of what we're going to call meta language in here as well. And so people who study linguistics, right, will track how language has changed over time, how culture has influenced language, etc. It meshes that with the idea of ethnography, which is a method of research that involves immersing oneself into a particular field. So what an ethnographer does is he or she goes into a field and lives with a particular culture themselves. The reason for that is because ethnography takes seriously the idea that you can't understand how a culture works without putting it into your body, without kind of making it yourself. Culture is something that lives within our bodies. And so there's no way to adequately understand what speech and language means within a culture other than by putting your own body on the line, by putting yourself out there and really taking that culture and putting it into your body. What we try to discover by meshing linguistics and ethnography is the idea of speech codes, which speech codes are a system of socially constructed symbols and meanings, right? So remember what symbols are from some of our other stuff in here, right? Symbols are things that mean, that stand in for other things, right? So we're curious what meanings are within a culture. Every culture has its own kind of understanding of what certain words mean. Words mean something in this culture that mean something different in another culture. Also rules, right? There are rules pertaining to communication conduct. So if you remember, for example, when we talked about expectancy violation theory, right, we talked about how different cultures have different rules about how personal space, right? So there might be speech codes surrounding personal space within certain kind of cultures. So for example, there are very different rules about how you communicate in a football game setting than there is than you'd communicate in a library. And if you communicate football rules in a library, right, there's going to have very different kind of meanings attached to that communication than if you were to do it at a football game. So what we're interested in is how cultures develop these kind of meanings, right? And they're all socially constructed. There's nothing there other than them being constructed by the cultures that they come from. Now Philipson examined two distinct cultures. He examined Teamsterville, which is a blue-collar working class neighborhood outside of Chicago, Illinois. Right, a very union town, if you were to think about it that way. And the other one he developed was Nakarima, which is actually American spelled backwards. What this is middle-class families. And how he did that is he observed and recorded conversation at dinner tables to see how it is that these people talk. Right, so we have here two distinct cultures, right? Middle-class America and right, blue-class working Chicago neighborhood. And Philipson was interested in the way that the two kind of talk, right? What are the speech codes that are different within each of these settings? What he really wanted to develop was a theory that explained the relationship between culture and communication, right? And so our culture influences our communication influences our culture. But what Philipson wants to know is exactly what's that relationship. What's happening? How does culture explain the way that we talk? And while this is an interpretive theory, it tries to move to prediction. That's one way that makes it a little bit weird. He wanted to move to being able to predict how people would communicate in certain kind of cultures. So Philipson gave us 6 propositions about speech codes. Six things that he said are true about speech codes that should tell us something about what they are and that relationship between culture and speech. So his first is proposition number 1, distinctiveness. He said, wherever there is a distinctive culture, there will be a distinctive speech code. This is a way of saying wherever cultural boundaries are drawn, whether those cultural boundaries are race, whether or not they're class, whether or not they're sexuality, whether or not they're gender, right, there is a distinct speech code. Each of those kind of cultures have their own ways of understanding what language is, what the rules are, what are the symbols, what's happening to make meaning here. But within these distinctive speech codes, they're taken for granted. So one way that we might point this, right, is we move in and out of these settings, in and out of cultures very smoothly, right? We don't freak out very often unless we don't know what's going on. So we can move from our home life, for example, maybe hanging out with your parents, to going out with your friends. You have very different speech codes within those different settings. But they're taken for granted. We don't likely sit down and say, okay, now I'm moving here, what's going to happen, right? Like, how are the speech codes shifting? They're just taken for granted. It's the way that things are. Within Teamsterville, Phillipson found a couple interesting things. He talked about men and women. Men and women have very distinct rules about how it is that they're allowed to communicate with each other. So, for example, women don't talk to men very often unless it's quote-unquote your man, for example. Women can talk to each other freely, and men can not quite talk to each other freely. That goes into the next one. But there are certain rules about how it is that they're to talk to each other. Now, there are symbols about that. If women were to talk to men who are not their man, that has a certain kind of symbolic construction. It would be seen as threatening. Also, power is really important in this setting as well. So men of higher power, like if a man of lower status within this setting, would not talk to a man of higher setting without having someone to help represent him. And so power is really important. Phillipson said, whereas other people might just see an average, ordinary city block, what Teamsterville people see are lines of power, lines of distinction drawn around about who's allowed to speak to who and in what kind of way. Also, speech and social solidarity. You only speak with people who are like you. You only speak to those people who are a part of your circle. So, people of different race, for example, you're not supposed to talk to those people within Teamsterville. This is the rules that are drawn within this setting. Now, in Nakamura, there are very different kind of rules. There's what we call meta-communication. Meta-communication is about communicating about communicating. He said that what tends to happen a lot in Nakamura is people will talk and say, what's wrong? You seem troubled. You seem bothered. Why aren't you talking more, right? Which is a way of communicating, trying to mend what's happening there by communicating about communicating. Individual differences are emphasized and stressed and actually praised, whereas in Teamsterville, solidarity is really what's praised, right? You're supposed to communicate in a way that makes you like everyone else, that benefits the whole. But in Nakamura, what you're supposed to do is communicate in ways that express yourself. And finally, communication is something that's valued. People are expected to communicate. It's not just like you have the option if you want to, but it's something that you contribute to the actual setting. So that's the first one, Proposition 1. Proposition 2 says, in any speech community, multiple speech codes are employed. We tend to use dual speech codes at the same time. An example that I like to give of this is something like within a classroom, right? We can certainly think of a classroom as a kind of community. Within that setting, right, there is certain kind of speech codes that are certainly followed. You're supposed to talk in certain kind of ways, right? You talk forward, you talk to the professor, you don't talk to each other. Right? Well, there are multiple speech codes being employed while you're in that moment because people do communicate to each other, right? But there are different speech codes that are used when they communicate to each other. So maybe when students communicate to each other, it's done in whispered tones, done with notes, in ways that you would never communicate to your professor in that particular setting. Now, in Teamsterville, Phillipson noticed a couple different kinds of multiplicity here. He said, right, some people tried to improve their speech. They tried to learn how to talk more grammatically effectively, or grammatically correctly. He says that actually what ended up happening in those situations are people said, what, you think you're too good for us? You think you're better than us, learning to talk differently, like you want to rise up through the ranks or something like that. He also said that there were certain cultural differences. So he talks about, if you read the book, he talks about like a Latino group of young men who hung out on the corner right over there. And these cultural differences, when people would have to communicate with this group, they would communicate in very different kind of ways than they would when they would communicate with each other. Within Nakamura, he found that this idea of small talk versus good talk. Small talk is not valued while good talk is. So small talk is stuff like, hey, how you doing? How's the weather? Etc. Hey, long time no see. You take care, right? That kind of stuff. There's a certain kind of speech code that goes along with that that's very different than the good talk, which is talk that's about like stuff that we would say quote unquote real. All right, I'll be right back, guys.